The Andorian Mining Consortium had, in their infinite wisdom and thoroughly documented arrogance, classified humans as Class D labor units, a designation that roughly translated to useful for reaching small spaces and operating delicate machinery, but please handle with extreme care, as they break easily. This assessment came from a species that had never lifted anything heavier than a ceremonial chalice in 3 generations, but who was keeping track of irony these days. The classification manual, printed on what could generously be called paper, but more accurately resembled pressed flower petals, stated in flowing script that humans possessed adequate cognitive function for basic technical tasks and surprising manual dexterity, despite their fragile skeletal structure. The document went on to recommend that human workers be provided with cushioned work surfaces and frequent rest periods to prevent catastrophic system failure being their delicate way of saying death. On mining station Zarion 7, suspended in the asteroid belt of the Kepler system like a metallic tumor on the galaxy's backside, this philosophy had been taken to heart with the enthusiasm of a religious convert. The station's corridors were lined with warning signs in 17 different languages, most of which boiled down to caution, humans at work, approach with extreme delicacy. The irony was thick enough to mine and sell at premium prices. The protagonist of our tale, let's call her the engineer, because names were for species that earned respect, had been watching this circus of condescension for 6 months now. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, with calloused hands that spoke of years wrestling with machinery that fought back, and eyes that had seen enough bureaucratic nonsense to fuel a small reactor. Her work coveralls bore the scars of honest labor, burn marks from welding torches, oil stains that had achieved permanent resident status, and tears that had been mended so many times they'd become decorative. The Thrakari supervisor, a being that resembled what might happen if a praying mantis had been stretched to 7 feet and given delusions of grandeur, watched her work with the sort of fascination typically reserved for watching someone defuse a bomb with their teeth. His forearms constantly twitched in what their species considered contemplative gestures, but which looked more like nervous tics to anyone with functioning eyes. Human unit, the supervisor clicked through his translator, which rendered his natural harmonic buzzing into something resembling actual language. Please exercise maximum caution with the plasma cutter. The safety protocols indicate your species requires. I know what the safety protocols say, the engineer replied, not bothering to look up from the steel beam she was reshaping with the precision of a surgeon and the efficiency of someone who had better things to do than listen to lectures from insects. The plasma cutter moved through the metal like it was suggesting a polite cut, rather than demanding one, leaving edges so clean they could have been used as mirrors. The Thrakari's antennae drooped in what passed for confusion among his people, but the manual states that humans require supervision when operating Class C industrial equipment. The manual was written by people who've never held a tool more complex than a eating utensil. The engineer finally looked up, and her gaze carried the sort of weight that made the supervisor's exoskeleton creak with involuntary tension. I've been cutting steel since before your species discovered fire was hot. This was, technically speaking, a biological impossibility given the respective lifespans involved. But the Thrakari had long ago learned that human expressions rarely meant what they literally stated. It was one of many mysteries about the species that the consortium had filed under curious linguistic quirks and promptly ignored. Around the station, similar scenes played out with the reliability of atomic decay. Volgan foremen, built like refrigerators with anger management issues, stood ready to catch human workers who might collapse from the extreme exertion of lifting anything heavier than a sandwich. Crystalline overseers, crystalline beings whose idea of physical labor was rearranging their mineral supplements, had installed cushioned platforms near every workstation in case humans needed to rest their fragile organic component. The humans, for their part, had developed a collective eye roll so synchronized it could probably be seen from orbit. They went about their work with the sort of resigned professionalism that came from being simultaneously indispensable and utterly misunderstood. They installed gravitic stabilizers that weighed more than small vehicles, rewired power systems that could fry an unprotected organic being in milliseconds, and maintained fusion reactors that operated at temperatures hot enough to make stars jealous. And through it all, their alien supervisors watched with the nervous attention of parents whose toddlers were playing with scissors. The engineer had become something of a legend among the human workers, though she'd have been the first to point out that being legendary, among a group of people who were universally underestimated, was rather like being the tallest building in a town of garden sheds. She could make a recalcitrant engine purr like a contented cat, convince a stubborn fusion reactor to behave through what could only be described as mechanical therapy, and had once repaired a critical life support system using spare parts, determination, and what the official report had diplomatically called unorthodox methodology. The aliens called it luck. The humans called it Tuesday. But luck, like patience, had its limit. And on this particular rotation, as the engineer watched a Thrakari supervisor explain to a human colleague why lifting a 40-pound component might cause structural damage to your primitive skeletal framework, those limits were approaching faster than a meteor with poor navigation skill. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to receive an education in the difference between fragile and restrained. And like most lessons delivered by underestimated teachers, it was going to be memorable. 3 rotations later, the consortium decided that their human workforce wasn't being properly managed. This conclusion came after an efficiency report indicated that humans were completing tasks 300% faster than projected, which the consortium's analysts interpreted not as evidence of human competence, but as proof that the safety protocols weren't stringent enough. Because clearly, the only explanation for exceeding expectations was that someone wasn't being sufficiently careful. The new directives arrived via priority data burst, transmitted with the sort of urgent fanfare typically reserved for declarations of war or announcements of free lunch. The Vulcan station commander, a being whose evolutionary ancestors had apparently decided that subtlety was for weaklings, gathered the supervisors in what passed for the conference room, a space that looked like someone had tried to decorate a bunker with delusions of grandeur. Effective immediately, the commander announced, his voice carrying the resonant quality of rocks being ground together, all human workers will be subject to enhanced supervision protocols. He gestured to a holographic display that flickered with the enthusiasm of technology that had given up caring. Each human unit will be monitored continuously and restricted to tasks deemed appropriate for their limitation. The engineer, who had been summoned along with the other humans ostensibly to ensure clear understanding of new procedures, stood at the back of the room with her arms crossed, in an expression that could have etched steel. Around her, her colleagues maintained the sort of neutral faces that came from years of practice in not throttling people who desperately needed throttling. The enhanced supervision protocols were, to put it charitably, humans would now be limited to lifting no more than 20 pounds without mechanical assistance. Any task involving heights greater than 6 feet would require a safety harness, 2 spotters, and a medical technician on standby. The operation of power tools would be restricted to designated human-safe periods, during which all other species would evacuate the immediate area to avoid potential collateral damage from human clumsiness. But the crown jewel of bureaucratic overreach was the new buddy system. Each human worker would be assigned an alien supervisor, whose sole responsibility was to ensure their biological charge didn't accidentally kill themselves through the apparently Herculean task of existing in an industrial environment. These supervisors would be armed with emergency medical kits, restraining devices for panic situations, and the authority to terminate any human activity deemed potentially harmful to organic integrity. The engineer raised her hand with the sort of deliberate motion that suggested someone was about to regret asking for questions. Yes, human unit, the commander acknowledged her with the tone of someone indulging a child's curiosity about why the sky was blue. Who exactly is going to maintain the fusion reactors during the human-safe periods? She asked, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone who had done the math and found it wanting. Because unless you've developed a sudden talent for quantum mechanics and high-energy physics, those reactors don't particularly care about your scheduling preferences. The commander's crystalline advisor, a crystalline whose body resembled a collection of geometric shapes that had gotten into an argument and decided to stick together out of spite, chimed in with a sound like wind through broken glass. Alternative arrangements will be made. The consortium has contracted with specialized maintenance drones. The engineer's eyebrow performed an athletic feat that would have impressed Olympic judges, Drone. To maintain fusion reactors that require intuitive adjustments based on harmonic variations that can't be programmed into algorithmic responses. She paused for effect, watching the aliens exchange the sort of glances that suggested they were beginning to suspect they might have overlooked something important. This should be educational. Over the following days, the enhanced supervision protocols were implemented with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine that had been designed by committee and assembled by the lowest bid. Human workers found themselves shadowed by nervous alien supervisors, who jumped at every tool drop and treated routine maintenance procedures like bomb disposal operations. The buddy system proved particularly enlightening. The engineer found herself paired with a Thrakari supervisor named, well, his actual name sounded like static electricity having an argument with a wind chime, so everyone just called him Clicks. Clicks had received extensive training in human physiology, which consisted mainly of dire warnings about how easily humans could be damaged, and a laminated card listing symptoms of what the manual termed catastrophic biological failure. Clicks buzzed nervously as the engineer approached a malfunctioning atmospheric processor that had been coughing out recycled air with all the enthusiasm of a chain smoker. The safety manual indicates this equipment operates at temperatures that could cause severe damage to your organic components. It's running hot, the engineer agreed, pulling on work gloves that had seen better decades. That's why it needs to be fixed before we all suffocate on our own exhalations. Perhaps we should wait for the specialized maintenance drones. The engineer's laugh could have powered a small generator. The drones that are currently stuck in customs because someone forgot to file the proper import permits for artificial intelligence units. Those drones? Clicks's antennae drooped in what his species considered an expression of dawning horror. Around the station, similar conversations were taking place as the reality of the enhanced supervision protocols collided with the immutable laws of industrial necessity, like a runaway freight train meeting a particularly stubborn mountain. The atmospheric processor chose that moment to emit a sound that fell somewhere between a death rattle and a mechanical sob. Warning lights began flashing with the disco enthusiasm that universally indicated fix this now or start writing your will. The engineer looked at Clicks, whose exoskeleton had begun developing stress fractures, and made the sort of executive decision that had kept civilizations running since the invention of civilization. Stay here, she said, grabbing her toolbox with one hand and a plasma cutter with the other, and maybe start practicing your emergency first aid. Something tells me you're going to need it. But not, as Clicks would soon discover, for the reasons anyone expected. The atmospheric processor had apparently decided that its mechanical death throes weren't dramatic enough and escalated to what could generously be called a tantrum, but more accurately resembled the sort of industrial catastrophe that made insurance adjusters weep into their actuarial tables. Sparks cascaded from its housing like angry fireflies, and the air began to carry that distinctive metallic taste that universally translated to things are about to get very expensive to fix. The engineer approached the failing machine with the casual confidence of someone who had spent years convincing temperamental equipment to behave through a combination of technical expertise and what could only be described as mechanical diplomacy. Behind her, Clicks vibrated at a frequency that suggested his nervous system was considering early retirement. Human unit, the safety protocols clearly state, he began, consulting his laminated card with the desperate intensity of someone looking for divine intervention in a parking ticket. The safety protocols, the engineer interrupted, already knee-deep in the processor's guts and elbow-deep in its attitude problem, were written by people who think hands-on experience means shaking hands with someone who once saw a wrench. She pulled out a component that looked like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against geometry and held it up to the light. This bearing assembly hasn't been properly maintained in approximately forever, and the thermal regulation system appears to have been installed by someone who thought close enough was an acceptable engineering standard. The repair took exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. The engineer emerged from the processor's mechanical entrails looking like she'd been wrestling with a particularly vindictive oil rig. But the machine was now purring with the contentment of equipment that had remembered its purpose in life. The air began to clear, taking on the crisp quality that meant everyone could stop holding their breath. Click stared at his laminated card, then at the engineer, then back at his card, with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been fed through a blender and reassembled by a committee of philosophers with opposing viewpoints. That was when the Volgan shift supervisor arrived, attracted by the commotion like a particularly bureaucratic moth to a regulatory flame. The supervisor stood nearly 8 feet tall and had the sort of presence that suggested his ancestors had evolved specifically to loom menacingly over smaller beings while delivering bad news. His name translated to something like "crusher of small things," which should have been everyone's first clue about his management philosophy. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the resonant authority of someone who had never been told no, and wouldn't have recognized it if it introduced itself with a formal presentation. "Human unit, you have violated 17 distinct safety protocols. The enhanced supervision guidelines clearly state that humans are fragile little flowers who might wilt if exposed to actual work," the engineer finished, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better geological eras. "I'm aware of what the guidelines. I'm also aware that we'd all be breathing recycled carbon dioxide and contemplating the philosophical implications of asphyxiation if someone hadn't fixed that process." The supervisor's massive frame swelled with the sort of righteous indignation that came from having one's authority questioned by someone who was supposed to know their place. "You will report to the disciplinary chamber immediately. This blatant disregard for established safety measures cannot be tolerated." Around the work area, other humans had begun to gather, drawn by that mysterious gravitational force that made crowds appear whenever authority figures were about to make spectacularly poor decisions. Their alien supervisors clustered nervously behind them, clutching their emergency medical kits and laminated safety cards like talismans against the chaos of actual competence. "Disciplinary chamber," the engineer repeated, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone who had reached the end of not just their rope, but the entire rope factory. "For fixing life support equipment that your specialized maintenance drones couldn't handle because they're still trapped in bureaucratic limbo. Your unauthorized actions put the entire station at risk," the supervisor declared, apparently operating under the fascinating delusion that preventing suffocation was somehow more dangerous than allowing it. "Humans require supervision for all technical operations. This is established science." That was when the engineer began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, the sort of sound someone makes when they realize they've been taking a cosmic joke serious, but it grew, developing into the kind of laughter that made nearby equipment vibrate sympathetically and caused small creatures to seek shelter. It was the laughter of someone who had spent months watching incompetence masquerade as expertise and had finally decided that the performance had gone on long enough. "Established science," she repeated, her voice now carrying undertones that made the atmospheric processor's earlier death rattles sound cheerful by comparison. "Based on observations by species who haven't done an honest day's physical labor since their civilizations discovered that other people could be hired to lift things." She walked over to a cargo container that the loading drones had been struggling to move for the past hour. The container, according to its manifest, weighed approximately 400 pounds and contained replacement parts for the mining equipment. The drones, designed with the aesthetic sensibilities of boxes with delusions of mobility, had managed to move it roughly 6 inches before giving up and entering what their programming optimistically called contemplation mode. The engineer grabbed the container's lifting handles and hoisted it above her head with the casual ease of someone picking up their morning coffee. She held it there for a moment, letting the implications sink in while the assembled aliens performed various species-specific expressions of disbelief. Then she set it down in its designated location with the gentle precision of someone placing a soap bubble on a silk pillow. "Your established science," she said, brushing imaginary dust from her hands, "appears to have some gaps in its research methodology." The supervisor's jaw worked soundlessly, performing calculations that his worldview wasn't equipped to process. Around him, the other aliens began to make the sort of nervous sounds that species made when they realized they might have fundamentally misunderstood something important. The engineer wasn't finished. She walked over to a damaged support beam that had been marked for replacement, a piece of structural steel that the work orders had scheduled for removal by heavy machinery sometime next week. She examined it for a moment, running her hands along its surface like a physician checking a patient's pulse. Then she grabbed it with both hands and began to bend it. Not with tools, not with mechanical assistance, not with anything except muscle, leverage and the sort of focused determination that had built civilizations and occasionally torn them down when they needed renovating. The steel beam, which had been designed to support several tons of industrial equipment, began to fold like origami in the hands of someone who had very strong opinions about its structural integrity. The sound it made, a deep resonant groan that spoke of molecular bonds reconsidering their life choices, echoed through the work area like a mechanical funeral dirge. When the engineer was finished, the beam had been transformed into something resembling a very large and expensive pretzel. She dropped it at the supervisor's feet, where it landed with the sort of final thud that punctuated statements that didn't require verbal emphasis. The symphony of shattered assumptions had begun, and it was playing in a key that the galaxy had never heard before. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a premium commodity in sectors where quiet was valued above precious metals. It was the sort of silence that occurred when fundamental laws of reality decided to take an unscheduled coffee break, leaving everyone to contemplate the philosophical implications of having their entire worldview fed through an industrial shredder. The Volgan supervisor stared at the pretzel that had once been a load-bearing support beam, his massive frame somehow managing to shrink despite occupying the same physical space. His evolutionary programming, designed over millions of years to recognize threats and respond appropriately, was sending him signals that roughly translated to apologize immediately and back away slowly, while making yourself as small as possible. This was complicated by the fact that his species had never actually developed the concept of backing down, leading to a sort of biological software conflict that made him twitch like a malfunctioning android. "That," said Clicks, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose reality had been thoroughly remodeled without a building permit, was a Class 7 structural component, rated for industrial loads up to. He consulted his laminated card, which now seemed about as useful as a chocolate teapot. 15,000 pounds of distributed pressure. The engineer wiped her hands on her coveralls with the casual satisfaction of someone who had just completed a routine maintenance task. "Was it real?" she said, examining her fingernails with the sort of attention typically reserved for fine art. Funny how it didn't mention that on the way down. Around them, the assembled crowd of aliens and humans had formed a rough circle, though the aliens had unconsciously positioned themselves considerably farther back than their human colleagues. The humans, for their part, were displaying various expressions that ranged from vindicated satisfaction to the sort of grim amusement that came from watching someone else finally say what everyone had been thinking. One of the human technicians, a grizzled veteran whose work clothes had achieved the sort of lived-in patina that spoke of decades spent convincing machinery to behave, stepped forward with a crowbar in his hand. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been wondering about something." He walked over to a supposedly indestructible storage locker that had been giving the alien workers trouble for weeks. The locker was designed to withstand everything up to and including direct meteor strikes, according to its manufacturer's specification. He inserted the crowbar into the locking mechanism and applied what could generously be called pressure. The lock, which had been designed by a species that considered a firm handshake to be aggressive physical contact, surrendered immediately. The door swung open with a squeak that sounded apologetic. "I've been wondering," he continued, setting the crowbar aside, "why we've been pretending that things designed by people who've never lifted anything heavier than their own expectations were somehow beyond our capability." That was when the dam burst, metaphorically speaking, though given recent demonstrations of human strength. Several aliens made mental notes to check the structural integrity of actual dams in human-occupied sectors. Across the station, humans began to demonstrate capabilities that the enhanced supervision protocols had deemed impossible. A maintenance worker casually straightened a bent conduit that had been scheduled for replacement. An engineer fixed a supposedly unrepairable power coupling using nothing but determination and what the manual would have called inadvisable applications of kinetic force. A technician resolved a stubborn alignment issue in the mining laser array by physically lifting the entire assembly and setting it down in the correct position. Each demonstration was accompanied by the sort of casual commentary that made it clear this wasn't a special occasion. It was Tuesday, and Tuesday had always been like this. They'd simply been polite enough to let everyone else maintain their comfortable delusion. The consortium's response was swift and predictable. Emergency communications flooded the galactic networks as administrators tried to process the implications of having fundamentally misunderstood an entire species. The classification of humans as Class D labor units was quietly updated to Class A specialist personnel in a bureaucratic maneuver that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so obviously motivated by terror. Within a standard rotation, every human worker on Zarian 7 had received what the consortium diplomatically called recognition adjustments, pay raises, improved quarters, and suddenly flexible working conditions that no longer included supervision by beings whose idea of heavy lifting was operating the controls for automated equipment. The engineer found herself promoted to Chief of Engineering Operations, a title that came with its own office, a staff of previously condescending aliens who now competed to bring her coffee, and the sort of salary that suggested the consortium was very interested in maintaining positive relations with someone who could fold structural steel like laundry. But perhaps the most telling change was in the galactic databases. The entry for human physical capabilities was updated from limited but adequate for basic tasks to proceed with extreme caution and maximum respect. The subsection on recommended interaction protocols now included helpful suggestions like do not underestimate and apologize early and often. The manual's new safety warnings were particularly educational. Where once it had cautioned about the fragility of human workers, it now included dire warnings about the fragility of everything else when humans decided they'd had enough of being underestimated. Equipment manufacturers began including disclaimers about warranty coverage being void if their products were subjected to human-level problem-solving techniques. 6 months later, as the engineer sat in her new office reviewing productivity reports that showed human-operated stations outperforming their purely alien counterparts by margins that made statisticians weep with joy, she reflected on the curious nature of galactic politics. The species that had once condescended to supervise human workers now sent representatives to study human engineering techniques. The Thrakari had developed an entire academic discipline around what they called applied human methodology, though they still couldn't quite bring themselves to admit they'd been spectacularly wrong about everything. Clicks, who had somehow managed to survive his educational experience with his exoskeleton intact, now served as her assistant. He'd adapted remarkably well to the new reality, though he still flinched whenever she reached for tools. His laminated safety card had been replaced with a much longer manual titled Working Effectively with Human Personnel as Survival Guide. The galaxy, it turned out, was a much more interesting place when you stopped assuming that the quiet species in the corner were quiet because they were weak. Sometimes, as several civilizations were now discovering, they were quiet because they were polite, and politeness, like patience, had its limit. The engineer smiled as she signed off on another report documenting the impossible repairs that human crews had completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Outside her office window, the mining operations continued with the smooth efficiency that came from having workers who could actually do their jobs without requiring supervision from people who'd never learned to do those jobs themselves. It was, she reflected, a beautiful sound. The symphony of competence finally being allowed to play at full volume, accompanied by the faint background music of shattered assumptions, and the occasional metallic groan of equipment that had learned to behave properly when humans were around. The galaxy had finally learned the difference between fragile and restrained. The education had been expensive, measured in bent steel and wounded pride, but some lessons were worth their weight in pretzel-shaped support beams.